Hello, I'm here during the lunch rush with Janice, who owns her own food truck.
Best cheesesteaks in town.
Janice traded up to Geico Commercial Auto Insurance for her food truck business. We're here where she needs us most.
They sure are.
We make it so easy for her to save, with customised coverage that grows with her business. Sorry, I just get so emotional talking about saving folks money.
Not this onion I'm chopping?
It's just so beautiful. Oh yeah, no, it's the onion.
Get a commercial auto insurance quote today at geico.com and see how much you could save. Get more with Geico.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Halloween Podcast. I am your host, Lyle Perez, and you're listening to episode 39 of our special series, The Dark Record, where we uncover history's eeriest stories, one strange and unsettling case at a time. On the morning of July 2nd, 1951, a quiet neighborhood in St. Petersburg, Florida, awoke to a horror that would puzzle investigators for decades. Inside her small apartment, 67-year-old widow Mary Reeser had been almost completely reduced to ash. Only her left foot, still inside its slipper, a few fragments of spine, and a shrunken skull remained. What baffled authorities was not just her destruction, but the scene around her. The room itself was mostly untouched. No raging fire, no burned-out apartment, just one woman reduced to nothing. The next entry into the dark record, the mysterious death of Mary Reeser. Let's begin. Before her death became legend, Mary Hardy Reeser was simply a woman living a quiet life in Florida. Born in 1884, she had spent her years much like countless others of her generation, married, raising a family, and eventually settling into widowhood. By 1951, she was 67 years old, living alone in a small apartment in St. Petersburg. Friends and neighbors described her as polite, reserved, and ordinary in nearly every way. She enjoyed routine, kept to herself, and never gave the impression of someone destined for infamy. Her health, however, was beginning to decline. She had become reliant on sedatives to sleep at night, often using barbiturates prescribed by her doctor. Like many of her generation, she was also a smoker. Cigarettes were part of her daily life, something no one thought much of at the time. To those who saw her in the days leading up to her death, she was no different than usual. A woman winding down in her later years, finding comfort in routine habits. On the evening of July 1st, Mary's son visited her apartment. He later recounted that his mother had been unusually drowsy, having taken 2 sedatives earlier in the day. She mentioned her plan to take 2 more before going to bed that night. She sat in her easy chair, dressed in her nightgown, with her slippers on her feet and a cigarette in hand. It was an unremarkable scene, the kind any family might witness when checking in on an aging parent. Sometime later that night, neighbors noticed the faint smell of smoke. At first, it drew little attention. Fires were not uncommon in Florida homes, and it didn't seem urgent. But by the following morning, July 2nd, the concern grew. When Mary's landlady came to deliver a telegram, she found the doorknob of the apartment hot to the touch. Alarmed, she called for help. When police and fire officials entered the small apartment, they were confronted with a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Where Mary Reeser had been sitting was little more than ash. Her easy chair had been destroyed, consumed down to springs and blackened cloth. The woman herself had been almost entirely incinerated. Yet the rest of the apartment was relatively untouched. A few plastic items had softened from heat, a nearby light switch had melted, and soot had risen to stain the walls. But the apartment had not burned. A fire powerful enough to reduce a human body to ash should have gutted the entire building. Instead, it seemed contained to one person, one chair, and nothing more. The landlady, stunned, could only whisper, "She's gone. She's burned up." It was the beginning of a mystery that no investigation, scientific or supernatural, would ever truly resolve. The discovery inside Mary Reeser's apartment was as disturbing as it was perplexing. Investigators documented the scene with disbelief, struggling to reconcile what they saw with what they knew about fire. Nearly all of Mary's body had been reduced to ash, her torso, limbs, and most of her head gone without a trace. Only her left foot remained intact, still inside its black satin slipper. Near it were small fragments of her spine. Most unsettling of all was the skull, not charred or broken, but described as shrunken to a fraction of its normal size, as though the flames had performed some grotesque surgical trick. The chair in which she had been sitting was nearly gone, destroyed in the blaze that had consumed her. But outside that small radius, the room bore little sign of catastrophe. Plastic household items, such as a nearby electric switch plate and the tips of candles, had softened or warped. Soot coated the upper walls and ceiling. But other objects, even within feet of the chair, remained untouched by flame. Curtains still hung at the windows. Newspapers piled on a table were only slightly singed. Her apartment was intact, except for the horrifying void where its tenant had been. The fire marshal on scene admitted he had never encountered anything like it. A normal house fire requires immense heat to reduce bone to ash, temperatures far higher than what a smoldering chair or cigarette could create. Crematoriums, equipped with industrial furnaces, take hours at 1,600 to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit to achieve what had happened in Mary Reeser's apartment. Yet here, in a modest Florida living room, nearly the entire body of a woman had vanished in a single night, leaving little more than soot and whispers. Even the evidence that did exist defied easy explanation. Fire normally causes skulls to fracture and expand as heat builds pressure within. Mary's skull, according to reports, had shrunk to the size of a teacup. Some investigators doubted this detail, suggesting it may have been exaggerated in later retellings, but those who claimed to have seen it firsthand insisted it was true. That image, the shrunken skull, the slippered foot, the pile of ash, became the core of the legend. Local authorities reached out for help. The FBI was called to examine the remains and the strange burn pattern. Investigators collected samples of ash, melted items, and residue from the apartment. To them, it seemed impossible that a fire powerful enough to destroy an entire body could spare the rest of the room. Yet the evidence in front of them was undeniable. Something had happened here, something that looked very much like a body burning from within. By the time the story reached the newspapers, the press had already given it a chilling name: spontaneous human combustion. And Mary Reeser, the quiet widow from St. Petersburg, became known around the world as the Cinder Woman. The idea of spontaneous human combustion, or SHC, has fascinated and terrified people for centuries. and Mary Reeser's death quickly became one of its most famous examples. To those who read about her case in 1951, the explanation seemed obvious. No ordinary fire could have produced what investigators had found. Something strange, something unnatural must have taken place. Spontaneous human combustion is exactly what the name suggests: the belief that a human body can ignite and burn without an external source of flame. The concept goes back at least to the 1600s, when scattered reports described people being discovered reduced to ash in otherwise untouched rooms. Most of these accounts had the same eerie details: a body destroyed, extremities left behind, and very little surrounding damage. By the 19th century, spontaneous human combustion had moved firmly into popular imagination. Writers seized on the mystery, none more famously than Charles Dickens. In his novel Bleak House, Dickens wrote the sudden fiery death of a character as spontaneous combustion, basing it on cases that had been reported in the press. Critics accused him of promoting superstition, but Dickens defended himself, insisting the phenomenon had been documented too often to be dismissed. In Mary Reeser's time, the idea had faded into the margins of folklore, a curiosity more than a real fear. But when the story of her death broke, newspapers revived the old term. Here at last was a modern case, one not buried in centuries-old European reports, but unfolding in contemporary America. Photographs of her apartment and descriptions of her remains circulated nationwide, and the phrase "spontaneous human combustion" splashed across headlines. For believers, Mary Reeser was proof. Her near-total incineration, contrasted with the intact room around her, fit the pattern perfectly. How else could her body be reduced to ash without fire damage spreading through her apartment? The shrunken skull, whether exaggerated or not, added a gruesome touch that suggested forces beyond ordinary flame. But skeptics urged caution. Many so-called cases of spontaneous human combustion in history had been dismissed upon closer investigation, often involving dropped lamps, overturned candles, or careless smoking. Human imagination, they argued, tended to exaggerate mysteries and downplay the mundane. Even so, Mary's case stood apart. The completeness of her destruction and the relatively untouched surroundings made it difficult to explain away so easily. Spontaneous combustion, real or not, became part of her legacy. Mary Reeser wasn't just a widow from St. Petersburg anymore. She was the woman who might have proven that the human body can, under mysterious circumstances, ignite from within. For those captivated by the supernatural, she was Exhibit A. For those seeking rational answers, she was a troubling puzzle that demanded further study. As the story of Mary Reeser's death spread across newspapers, speculation about spontaneous human combustion only grew louder. But behind the scenes, investigators pushed for a more grounded explanation. The St. Petersburg police requested assistance from the FBI, hoping that federal resources might uncover what local officials could not. The FBI's fire experts examined ash samples, melted plastic, and soot from the apartment. Their findings steered the case away from supernatural conclusions. According to their report, Mary's death was not the result of mysterious forces, but of a tragic accident rooted in two habits: sedatives and cigarettes. On the night of July 1st, Mary had taken several sleeping pills. She was deeply sedated, perhaps even immobile, when she sat in her easy chair with a cigarette in hand. Investigators concluded she likely dozed off, and the cigarette slipped from her fingers, igniting her nightclothes. But what happened next was what set this fire apart. Mary was an older woman with a higher body fat composition. When her nightgown caught fire, the flames melted her skin and released liquefied fat. That fat soaked into the chair cushions and upholstery, creating a self-feeding blaze. Her body effectively became the fuel, with the chair acting as a wick. Fire experts called this process the wick effect, and they believed it explained how she could be reduced almost entirely to ash while her surroundings remained largely untouched. The wick effect theory solved many of the puzzle's contradictions. It accounted for why the fire burned hot enough to consume bone without spreading uncontrollably through the apartment. It explained the localized soot and the warped plastics. It even fit with historical reports of alleged spontaneous combustion, suggesting those cases too might have been smoldering accidents fueled by body fat rather than supernatural fire. Still, the FBI's conclusion didn't erase every unsettling detail. Critics pointed out that cremation requires sustained temperatures of 1,600 degrees or more to reduce bone to ash. Could a chair fire truly reach that level? The claim of a shrunken skull also troubled many, since skulls typically fracture under heat rather than shrink. Some suggested the description was a misunderstanding or later exaggeration, while others insisted it was real evidence of something stranger. The FBI remained firm. There was no evidence of foul play, and nothing in the scene required paranormal explanations. Mary Reeser's death was ruled an accidental fire, tragically explained by cigarettes and sedatives. Yet for those who had seen the remains, or for readers who encountered the lurid headlines, the rational answer didn't sit easily. The phrase spontaneous human combustion continued to cling to her name, overshadowing the FBI's sober report. Mary Reeser became a case study in how official conclusions and popular imagination often diverge. To science, she was a tragic but explainable accident. To the public, she was a woman consumed by a fire no one could see coming. Even after the FBI closed its file, Mary Reeser's story refused to fade. If anything, the official explanation only sharpened the divide between science and the public imagination. To experts, her death illustrated the Wick effect in grim detail. To the world at large, she became an enduring mystery that the human body could ignite without warning. The press played a major role in shaping her legacy. Local and national newspapers seized on the case, publishing lurid headlines and unsettling descriptions of the remains. Stories emphasized the shrunken skull and slippered foot, creating images that lodged in the public's mind. Reporters coined phrases like Florida's burning mystery, ensuring that her name would be forever linked to spontaneous human combustion. The fact that she was an ordinary widow, living a quiet life in a modest apartment, only deepened the sense of horror. If this could happen to Mary Reeser, it could happen to anyone. Over time, the case entered the realm of paranormal lore. Writers on unexplained phenomena cited her alongside other alleged combustion victims from centuries past. Paranormal magazines, late-night radio shows, and even television documentaries revisited her death, often ignoring the FBI's conclusion in favor of the more dramatic idea that her body had burned from within. The photograph of her unburned foot became one of the most reproduced images associated with SHC, a haunting reminder of the strange line between fact and folklore. The case also influenced popular culture. Novels, television programs, and horror anthologies retold the story, sometimes embellishing details or exaggerating the mystery. Mary Reeser became less a woman and more a symbol, the face of a phenomenon that continues to fascinate. Even skeptics couldn't deny her importance. For them, she was the perfect case study to illustrate how a slow, smoldering fire could mimic the impossible. For believers, she was the modern proof that spontaneous human combustion was real. In St. Petersburg, her story lingered as a kind of local legend. Residents who remembered the incident spoke of it in hushed tones, recalling how firefighters and neighbors were shaken by the sight. For decades, her name surfaced in October newspaper columns and Halloween lists of the unexplained. The curiosity hasn't waned. Even now, more than 70 years later, Mary Reeser remains the most famous alleged case of human combustion in the United States. Her legacy is one of ambiguity, caught between accident and anomaly, science and superstition. And in that uncertainty lies the reason her story endures. It is not simply about a woman who died in a fire. It is about the human need to explain the inexplicable, to find meaning in horror, and to decide whether we believe in coincidence, chemistry, or something beyond both. What unsettles me most about Mary Reeser's case is not just the grisly details, but how ordinary it all seemed before it became extraordinary. A woman in her late 60s living quietly in an apartment, ending her day with sedatives and a cigarette. That could describe thousands of people in 1951. There was nothing unusual about her routine. Yet within hours, her name would be etched into history as the centerpiece of one of the strangest deaths ever recorded. The image investigators described lingers like a shadow. The intact foot, the shrunken skull, the ash where a life had been. Even knowing the FBI's explanation, it is hard to imagine such devastation contained so neatly in a single chair. Fires spread. They consume everything. But in Mary's case, it seemed the flames had been selective, destroying only her body and little else. That contradiction is what makes this story so haunting. I think about how easily extraordinary mysteries can grow from ordinary tragedies. If Mary had lived in another era, her death might have been dismissed as an accident and forgotten. Instead, it happened in the middle of the 20th century, when newspapers were hungry for sensation and the public still carried a fascination with strange phenomena. In that environment, Mary Reeser became more than a victim. She became a symbol of our need to see something larger in tragedy, whether it's a warning, a miracle, or a curse. The truth may well be that Mary Reeser was consumed by the wick effect, a bizarre but natural process of fire. But the story refuses to stay confined to that box. Each time it's retold, it reminds us of the fragile line between explanation and mystery. We all want answers, yet sometimes the most unnerving cases are the ones that seem solved and unsolved at the same time. Mary's death is remembered because it forces us to sit with that discomfort. It's not just about fire. It's about how quickly the ordinary can collapse into the inexplicable, and how even the simplest routines can carry the seeds of legend. That brings us to the end of episode 39 of The Dark Record. We've explored the strange and tragic case of Mary Hardy Reeser, the Florida widow reduced almost entirely to ash in her own living room. From the unsettling remains to the FBI's Wick Effect explanation, her death has continued to blur the line between accident and anomaly. For believers, she is proof of spontaneous human combustion. For skeptics, she is a case study in how tragedy can be twisted into legend. Either way, her story endures, remembered, retold, and now added to the record. Next time, we move from fire on the ground to mystery in the skies. In 1978, a young pilot named Frederick Valentich vanished over the Bass Strait in Australia after reporting a strange craft hovering above him. His final radio transmission left behind one of the most chilling aviation mysteries in history. We'll examine the vanishing of Frederick Valentich. Until then, I'm Lyle Perez, and this has been the Halloween Podcast presenting The Dark Record. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It helps keep the show alive and weird. You can also explore sources, extras, and more at our Facebook page at facebook.com/The Halloween Podcast or at our website, thehalloweenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening. Keep your eyes on the shadows, and remember, not every fire leaves its secrets behind. Some burn so hot, they take the truth with them. Have a good night.